My topic is engaging a Chinese alterity, gardening in the Chinese style in 18th century Britain. Last Sunday morning, when I was preparing for the transcript for today, a natural history program was on BBC Radio 4. A voice said, "The English landscape garden are the most successful aesthetic export. Its inspiration is even seen in the Central Park at New York." So the speaker obviously having in mind, such magnificent gardens as Blenheim Palace. This is a familiar reiteration of what Nicholas Pevsner stated over half a century ago. The idea that the English landscape garden was Britain's greatest contribution to the visual arts of the world has come down deeply in the nation's psyche. It's not just on the radio, but on TV programs, on internet, or even when I was chatting with my neighbor Andrew, who was always on his knees, mud on his hand, tending his garden. However, little is known that over 300 years ago, when English self-consciously discussed garden matters and sought excellence, they were looking at examples elsewhere. First, on the continent, the Italian, the French, and the Dutch had all been their models. At the end of the 17th century and across the 18th century, the English were infatuated with a new style, the Chinese gardens. That was a time when a craze for China prevailed. Objects either from China or imitating the Chinese style, from porcelain tableware to bedroom or closet furniture, from winding paths in the park to garden architecture like a pagoda and a bridge, enthralled the English upper and middle classes' households and gardens. As one 18th century source put it, everything is Chinese, all in the Chinese taste, or as it is sometimes more modestly expressed, partly after the Chinese manner. After the 18th century, the China vogue was in rapid decline. As far as gardening is concerned, very little evidence of the Chinese vogue remains. The pagoda at Kew is a rare example. Surprisingly, little of the whole history of the exciting cross-cultural dialogue in the 18th century is heard today. Inside academia, scholars generally accepted that at face value 18th century accounts that see the Chinese style, or Xinhua Zui, as having mighty, whimsical appearance, but of no great social or cultural consequences. Such follies, as one historian put it, were merely incidental to the English park and intended only to provoke a thrill of exotic delight. In the last few decades, there has been increasing scholarship reviewing this issue critically. David Porter argued that the embrace of Chinese exoticism represented a revolt against the strictures of classical taste, although I think Nick shared just with us a very refreshing view. So Porter argued that the Chinese taste provided alternative to the dominant classist aesthetics of universality and just proportion. Stacy Sloboda situated objects of Xinhua Zui as a critical visual and material language, which he linked to a developing notion of the Chinese being synonymous with the concept of hybridity, disorder, and illegibility. More radical is perhaps Zhiming Yang's study. Dismissing the Eurocentrism of post-colonial studies, she sees China as an exemplary exception to a reductive colonizer/colonized paradigm that overstates European dominance. These revisionist scholarship paved the way for rethinking gardening in the Chinese style in 18th century England, through the concept of alterity. In the limited time available, I sketch out some examples of gardening in the Chinese style, as represented in English text and images across the century, with a focus on three themes: the Chinese as an example, the Chinese as a Gothic, and the Chinese of authenticity. Engaging with these, the above-mentioned scholars, I shall also suggest how Michael Bachtin's formulation of alterity, not simply as exclusion, but as an apartness that stands as a precondition of dialogue, may be particularly helpful for our examination. The landmark author for the beginning of English interest in Chinese gardens is William Temple. In his classic essay of 1685, he contrasted the regular forms of European gardens with the designed irregularity of their Chinese counterparts, where the beauty shall be great and strike the eye, but without an order or disposition of parts that shall be commonly or easily observed. Joseph Addison's Spectator essay of 1712 echoed Temple's account, noting that the Chinese chose to show a genius in works of this nature, and therefore always conceal the art by which they direct themselves. Contrasting European topiary to the Chinese style, he added that I would rather look upon a tree in all its luxuriancy and the diffusion of boughs and branches than when it's cut and trimmed into a mathematical figure. This enthusiastic reception of the Chinese garden conformed with the overall positive evaluation of China by European intellectuals in the early Enlightenment. In a time when Europe's future global dominance was not assured, many European authors were interested in other civilizations' approaches to issues in which they themselves were interested. Building and landscaping matters as vehicles of constructing power and subjectivity were clearly among these topical issues. In 1728, Robert Castell expressed the view that the designer of Pliny the Younger's garden at Tusculum had been not unacquainted with the manner of the Chinese garden, in which, though the parts are disposed with the greatest art, the irregularity is still preserved, so that their manner may not improperly be said to be an artful confusion. To strengthen his point, Castell cited as testimony a set of prints illustrating the then Chinese emperor's gardens. The analogy between Roman and Chinese gardens may strike us as a surprise today, but for Castell and his contemporary reader, both exemplified the wisdom of the ancients who sublimated the essence of nature in their art. In a similar vein, Thomas Robinson celebrated the arrival of the Chinese style of landscaping in Britain in 1737, citing, among others, Lord Colborne's garden at Stowe. When finished, it has the appearance of beautiful nature, and without being told, one would imagine art had no part in the finishing, and is, according to what one hears of the Chinese, entirely after their models for works of this nature, where they never plan straight lines or make regular designs. The above accounts from the cultural elites in England did not assume that their gardens was aesthetically superior to China. On the contrary, they showed an active interest in what could be learned from having a dialogue with the Chinese example, regarded on a par with nature and ancient Rome. So it seems that we may side with Zhiming Yang's modifying the emphasis on Eurocentrism of post-colonial theory, and as she suggests, consider the heuristic force of an example of China. From the 1730s to the late century, the craze for Xinhua III yielded thousands of pavilions, temples, bridges, and pagodas. The Chinese house in Stowe is perhaps the earliest recorded as of 1738. But what characterizes designs of the Xinhua's re-architecture of this time period is that accuracy was of little concerns. Remarkably, the peak time of Xinhua's re-architecture saw a remarkable convergence of the Chinese and the Gothic. At Davenport House, which was landscaped, as you can see on the left, to the new Chinese taste in 1753, and as represented in the painting, which doesn't really show the realistic scene at the site, but the owner's imagination, we can see a Chinese bridge and a medieval market cross, both fictional, appeared in an imagined mountainous Chinese landscape. And the zeitgeist of the time was fully captured by a number of architectural pattern books, such as William Halfpenny's Chinese and Gothic Architecture, properly ornamented. The author stated, as there is nothing more acceptable and advantageous to the public in invention and variety of construction, especially in architecture, we have endeavored to oblige with several new designs, both in the Gothic and Chinese manner, with intent to advance as much as in our power that noble science in compliance to the present taste. And he further proposed, in the name of invention and variety, the art of designing architecture is not confined to any particular taste or country, more than just justly observing a graceful symmetry and an exact proportions through the whole. And further, elsewhere, we would not be understood to aim at eclipsing the munificence of Roman architecture, but justly to promote each in their proper situations. This way, both the Gothic and Chinese style, as Porter suggests, provided alternative classicist aesthetics. They both partook of a spirit of architectural experimentation, loosely informed by distant, exotic, and distinctly anti-classical models. Here, both the Chinese and Gothic served as authority. But in this mid-century context, the representations of authority are not rational assertions of a dominant, clearly identified Western self over an epistemological or racially inferior other. Instead, the authority is made by what Bakhtin called apartness, a distance made either historically or geographically. In pleasure resulting from novelty, hybridity, and illegibility, both the Western self and the other can't be clearly depicted, but constantly intersect and interoperate. So finally, very quickly, the claims to the authenticity of the Chinese style was rarely heard until William Chambers published his designs of Chinese buildings. So the future architect of Kew Gardens had been to Canton at least twice in his youth. The unique experience gave him such an edge that he could claim authenticity for his volume on Chinese designs. Unhappy with half-Penny's half-Chinese and half-Gothic fribble, Chambers stated that his book was to putting a stop to the extravagancies that daily appear under the name of Chinese. He rightly noted that our notions of Chinese architecture are very imperfect. In making the Chinese intelligible and subsequently claiming authenticity for his own designs of Chinese architecture and gardens, Chambers established a form of cultural essentialism for China that, although with different intention, shares much with the more explicitly racist Orientalist discourse in the 19th century. For example, he considered Chinese architecture as a taste much inferior to classical architecture. Similarly, he considered the Chinese people as great or wise only in comparison with the nations that surround them. And he has no intention to place them, the Chinese, in competition either with the ancients or with the modern parts, the moderns of this part of this world, i.e. Europe. This shift in Chambers' attitude towards China from the early assessors like Temple reflects Britain's rapid growth as a global power and the rise of a Eurocentric Western self in the second half of the 18th century. Now, jumping to my conclusion or final remarks. Well, I think later, after Chambers, we began to hear some very explicit denial of connections with the Chinese taste. That we started to hear that English gardening is completely grows out of its own soil. But this kind of denial, which continues today, as I cited as a beginning, I don't think it's just the denial that makes our study of alterity imperative. As the English garden symbolizes the identity of the English imperial culture, a full understanding of that identity cannot be separate from any investigation into the process of the shifting English perceptions of the Chinese gardens. Whether China was an example or a hybrid other that intermingled with the Gothic or being rejected as bad taste, China's sheer apartness, which is not simply alienness, was a precondition for the English ability to understand and formulate its beloved style of Xinhua 3, destined to be assimilated into its subjectivity. Thank you very much.